The Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation will come to order. Today we're having a hearing on enhancing data security. And this is about the second in a series of hearings that we're having on the importance of good federal standards for both privacy and data security. Our first hearing focused on the empowerment of the FTC with new resources in the Data Privacy Bureau that is being considered as part of our reconciliation negotiations, as well as hearing from the witnesses what we should be doing to enhance further data privacy. Today we want to focus on data security and the fact that we are seeing record levels of breaching and intrusions on the privacy of American individuals. Our hearing today will hear from a great list of witnesses that I will mention and more formally introduce in a few minutes. The data systems that we rely on today are very vulnerable. We are experiencing increases rate of data breaches and now seeing sophisticated actors impacting hundreds of millions of American consumers. I think that we're going to hear from Mr. Lee's report that 2021 will again set a record year for the number of data breaches and concerns to consumers in the United States. What's troubling about that is that every year we are breaking records. What's troubling is that these breaches are now more sophisticated and that we don't have the adequate security to help stop them. Earlier this year, a hacker took Colonial Pipeline offline, causing fuel shortages across the East Coast. Ransomware attacks on hospitals have put patients' lives at risk. We heard yesterday about Facebook going offline globally due to faulty configuration. There's word out this morning that Amazon may be facing its own situation today. So part of the problem is that we live in a more connected world. And what we know now is that when there is a data breach, that consumers are the ones that pay the heavy price. We do not have enough on the books and a federal standard to make sure that companies are more accountable to these breaches. Senator Wicker and I have both introduced legislation trying to set a federal data security standard in the United States. We agree that we need to monitor these systems for threats and vulnerabilities, patch their system softwares when they needed updates, make individuals who serve as data privacy officers to be more efficient in their oversight, and we agree that the Federal Trade Commission should enforce these standards along with attorney generals. We believe that these companies don't invest enough for the fact that they have oversight to our precious data and information. So we need to act. Massive amounts of personal data are collected from Americans every day as they go online to connect with family, pay bills, work, obtain medical information, send their kids to school. And yesterday was an example of the data that was being collected on children and the offense that we all took to that information and data. Data is collected on Americans whether they like it or not. And we all know stories of data brokers and the breaches behind the scenes where data was collected without anybody's actual acquiescence to that. So today, Mr. Lee, who is with the Identity Theft Research Center, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping identity theft victims, will be testifying, and according to the ITRC's third quarter 2021 breach analysis report, we will again see a record year of breaches in the United States, and that these tactics are putting people in greater risk. That's very concerning to me in the state of Washington, where in 2020 we saw 7 times the rate of identity theft complaints to the FTC over 2019. So this means that 2021 is going to continue to have an even larger number. Hackers are specifically targeting data like login and passwords and often reuse them across multiple accounts, unlock access to accounts, and cybercrime is lucrative, and the data breaches that we are seeing not only, as I said, compromise our data, but are now a big business of cyber and ransomware attacks. The number of reported data breaches in the first 9 months of 2021 exceeded last year's 12-month by 17%. So the numbers keep rising, and we're on to another record-breaking year. About 160 million individuals had their data compromised from July of this year to September 21. There have been more ransomware attacks in the first 9 months of 2021 than in both 2019 and 2020. And the number of cyber attacks so far this year has already surpassed the total number of all data compromises in the year of 2020. So these intrusions take a real toll on people. Last year, the state of Washington was swept with an insurance fraud as it related to unemployment benefits. Later in the year, the Washington State Auditor's Office, which had been receiving unemployment fraud claim, had its data compromised due to that vulnerability in the legacy system that was provided by a third party, Acelion. Acelion's systems were breached throughout the country, and we still don't know the extent of that breach. But in Washington, the personal information of 1.6 million residents was stolen. So we know that the identity theft can have a devastating impact on individuals who can't obtain unemployment benefits because a criminal has already applied for them. 40% of these victims were not able to pay their bills. 14 were evicted for not paying rent. 33% did not have enough money for food and utilities. 13% were not able to get a job. So while most identity theft victims lose less than $500, 21% of these victims report losing more than $20,000. And these are a lot of people, growing every year in numbers. So we need to act to inform a better national standard for data security, to protect Americans' personal data and privacy so they are less at risk. That's why we introduced the Consumer Online Privacy Act, COPPER, last Congress, along with my colleagues here on the committee, Senator Schatz, Klobuchar, and Markey, and to continue to grow and strengthen our federal statutes so we can address these issues. So we look forward to hearing from the witnesses today about those particulars on how we strengthen these standards, what we need to do to protect whistleblowers, what we need to do to report data security and privacy problems, and what we can do to better protect the public. We know that a stronger FTC will help, but we need to give the FTC the resources that they need to do their job. So I, again, will introduce the witnesses in a few moments, but I think we have a very distinguished panel here to hear from on these important issues. So now I'll turn to the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you, Senator Cantwell. Appreciate it very much. And good morning to our witnesses. Each year, Americans benefit from a growing supply of digital products that make life better. At the same time, they also collect, share, and sell our personal data. Although this data can provide meaningful insights about consumer preferences, it has become a target for bad actors seeking to exploit people's data for nefarious purposes. According to reports, data breaches have gone up by 38% this year alone. These include phishing attacks, ransomware attacks, supply chain attacks, and more. The average cost of a data breach in the United States is roughly $8 million. But the cost to the broader public is hard to measure. Data breaches can bring long-term damage to reputations, personal finances, and even to physical safety. When Congress passed the FTC Act in 1914, the Federal Trade Commission was given the task of protecting consumers from deceptive and unfair commercial practices. The Commission has rightly used this authority to curb business practices that put consumers' personal information at risk. It has required companies to adopt stronger protections for consumer data and, in some instances, implement safeguards such as employee training, maintaining access controls, and monitoring systems for data security incidents. The FTC also continues to inform the private sector on best practices to prevent security breaches. Importantly, the FTC's longstanding approach to data security has been based on reasonableness. With cyber threats constantly evolving and growing more complex, there's no single or perfect solution to the problem. The FTC needs the flexibility to adjust to constantly shifting cyber threats. Under the Obama administration, the Commission asserted this standard of reasonableness in a bipartisan statement. I'm going to quote what the Commission said. A company's data security measures must be reasonable and appropriate in light of the sensitivity and volume of consumer information it holds, the size and complexity of its business, and the cost of available tools to improve security and reduce vulnerabilities. There is no one-size-fits-all data security program. The mere fact that a breach occurred does not mean that a company violated the law. End of quote. Although this remains true today, there's certainly more that Congress can and should do to make consumer data safer and protect Americans from cybercrime. In July, Senator Blackburn and I introduced the Safe Data Act, which would give the FTC more tools and authorities to improve data security practices in the marketplace and deter cyber criminals. Our legislation would require covered entities to minimize the amount of personal consumer data they collect and retain. It would require businesses to maintain certain internal controls to reduce risks to data. It would give the FTC targeted rulemaking authority to ensure companies can identify security vulnerabilities. It would expand the FTC's jurisdiction over common carriers and nonprofits. And to make sure companies follow the law, our bill would allow the FTC to impose civil penalties for first-time offenses. Many of these ideas represent areas of bipartisan common ground among members of this committee. Today's hearing is an opportunity to discuss how these and other steps can improve data security through bipartisan federal privacy legislation. As I said last week, Americans deserve to have their data protected. Now is the time for Congress to act to pass legislation that protects the American people's privacy and personal information. Thank you, Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Senator Wicker. And again, welcome to the witnesses. We are joined by Mr. James Lee, who is Chief Operating Officer of Identity Theft Resource Center, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping identify identity theft victims and analysis reports that are so helpful. In fact, I think we have part of your record is a pretty healthy report on this year's data. We'd also like to welcome Ms. Jessica Rich, who is currently counsel at Kelly Dreyer, former Bureau of Consumer Protection at the Federal Trade Commission, where you had experiencing a vast number of roles at the FTC, including the agency's Bureau of Consumer Protection Director, where you oversaw actions against companies who failed to uphold the promise to consumers. So thank you for being here. In addition, we have Ed Felton, who is the Robert E. Kahn Professor of Computer Science and Public Affairs at Princeton and former Chief Technologist, I think that was the title, at the Federal Trade Commission. So we look forward to hearing your comments as it relates to your time there and now and understanding the marketplace. And finally, Ms. Katie Tomarello, is that right? Tomarello, who is Executive Director of Engine, a nonprofit startup advocacy group to discuss the importance of data security in the ecosystem. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here. We'll start with you, Mr. Lee.
Good morning, Chair Cantwell, Ranking Member Wicker, the rest of the committee. Thank you for the honor of speaking with you today. My name is James Lee. I am the Chief Operating Officer of the nonprofit Identity Theft Resource Center. We're based in San Diego, California, and the chair was very kind to share a lot of our data for this morning that we just released in our Q3 data breach report. So I'm not going to talk about those numbers as much as I am now going to talk about the impacts, but I will say that we are now, as of today, only 238 data breaches away from an all-time high. And we had 446 data breaches in this quarter, so you can do the basic math. We're in for a raising the bar substantially. Let's discuss the real-world example of what I'm talking about, which is poor cybersecurity leads to data breaches, which leads to identity crimes. That's the value chain we're talking about. And let's talk specifically about the identity-related unemployment fraud. The ITRC advisors first realized there was a problem last year when we started getting calls from Seattle. Now, we don't get a lot of calls about unemployment fraud. Shortly after the federal unemployment subsidies went into effect, we started to receive one call a day. That then became a couple of calls a day, and very quickly it became where we had more contacts in 1 month than we had seen from all 50 states in 2 years.
Thank you.
It was a rapidly increasing problem. In 2019, we logged 14 cases of identity-related unemployment fraud. From March 2020 through last week, the ITRC has logged 2,112 cases of unemployment identity fraud in all 50 states and the District of Columbia, and it continues today. Behind all these numbers, though, are people. They're victims. And the victims in this case fall into two cases. People who were still employed but whose information was misused to apply for benefits they did not need. They were largely inconvenienced, but they are still at risk, increased risk, of future crimes because their data is in the hands of criminals. But for the victims who were denied benefits, these cyber criminals got the money first. And our research shows, as the chair noted, 40% were unable to pay their bills, 14% were evicted, 33% could not pay for food. As of April of this year, we found that 69% of the victims denied benefits last year still had not resolved the issues as of this year. All of these issues are directly linked to identity criminals misusing stolen personal information, largely from data breaches, often directly linked to poor cybersecurity practices, procedures, and executions. Which begs a very simple question with a very complex answer. What do we do? In the ITRC's view, the status quo is broken. We believe policymakers and industry leaders need to work together to focus on three key areas, which I'm now going to talk about. We need better cybersecurity standards and practices. For example, cyber attacks against known but unpatched software flaws that come from data breaches, they lead to data breaches, those results are largely preventable. You can prevent those kinds of cyber attacks. Another highly effective tool, don't collect the information if you don't need it. And if you are through with it, get rid of it. You cannot breach what you do not have. Very simple concept. But without enforceable minimum standards, there are no broad incentives beyond trying to avoid headlines or post-breach litigation that get people to actually make the broad organizational changes that are often needed. We need better enforcement. We believe victims are best served when there are options for redress. In today's environment, where some states are more aggressive in protecting their citizens than others, the result is often disparate victim support for the same crime, but what you're able to get accomplished for the victim varies by where you actually are. Technology moves faster than government, so state and local jurisdictions need the ability to be responsive to new threats and technologies while maintaining a minimum base of strong security and privacy. And we believe our partners at the FTC are best equipped to be that enforcement agency. Finally, our victim notification system is wholly inadequate. The first U.S. data breach law was proposed in 2003 by a certain senator from Washington. California lawmakers took that and actually passed the data breach law that same year. Since then, the average number of data breaches reported in the United States has grown to about 5 a day. The average number of data breaches reported in the European Union is 331 a day. What? Couple that with the estimated 15 billion stolen logins and passwords available for sale in identity marketplaces at any given time, and it is pretty obvious that data breaches are underreported in the United States. In our view, today's hearing is ultimately about how we reduce the number of identity crime victims. Yet there's a separate conversation we also need to have about how we support people when they're victimized. That victim support system we have today is just as inadequate as our cybersecurity standards, our enforcement structure, and our system of victim notification. The ITRC would love to talk to you about that too sometime. Thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Lee, and again, thank you for your annual reports and the information that you provided to the committee. I don't even know if in the Q&A I'll get to ask all my questions about that, but I am interested in the state rankings, and you have data that shows what's going on in each state. So I think that that's also interesting data for our committee members. So thank you. Ms. Rich, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Be ready for that.
Chair Cantwell, Ranking Member Wicker, and members of the committee. I'm Jessica Rich of counsel at Kelly, Dry & Warren, and also a distinguished fellow at Georgetown Law. I'm pleased to be here today testifying on the need to strengthen data security protections in this country. My remarks today are my own, based on my years in government service. And my background is as a lawyer and a law enforcement official. I worked for 26 years at the Federal Trade Commission, the last 4 as its director of Bureau of Consumer Protection. Before becoming the director, I was the first and longtime manager of the FTC's privacy program. I've supported stronger data privacy and security laws for over 20 years. Providing reasonable security for consumer data is at the heart of privacy protection. Without it, data can easily be stolen or compromised by hackers or corrupt insiders. And that's what we've seen again and again. Scores of data breaches that harm consumers and businesses alike in the form of fraud and identity theft, loss of trust, and business disruption. Because commercial systems are highly connected to the nation's infrastructure, these compromises undermine our national security as well. One of the key problems is that current law fails to set clear standards for data security or provide adequate remedies. Most of the FTC's data security efforts are based on the FTC Act, a law that leaves wide gaps in protection and doesn't even authorize penalties for first-time violations. While there are sector-specific laws with a data security component, and half the states now have their own data security laws, it's a messy and confusing patchwork. For all of these reasons, I strongly support federal data security requirements, whether as part of a broader privacy law or on its own, if that can be done, to bring stronger protections and greater clarity to the marketplace. My written remarks detail the main elements I recommend in such a law, so many of which are already contained in some form in both the chair's and the ranking member's privacy bills. The convergence between these bills reflects hard work and commitment by this committee and shows that a federal data security standard is truly within reach. The committee's efforts to create a new privacy bureau at the FTC, something I've also personally championed, will also make an enormous difference for data protection in this country. So in terms of the elements, first, the law should provide comprehensive protections and a level playing field across the marketplace. This means giving the FTC jurisdiction over nonprofits and common carriers, which they don't currently have jurisdiction over. Second, the law should take a process-based approach that is scalable to different types and sizes of companies and the volume and sensitivity of the data they collect. Otherwise, the law could quickly become obsolete or impose requirements ill-suited and unattainable for small businesses. And there should be requirements or incentives for data minimization, as my fellow panelists just discussed. Third, the law should extend broadly to the wide range of data that in the world of AI and algorithms and IoT and sophisticated consumer profiling can cause consumer privacy harm. This means data that is reasonably linkable to a consumer and categories of data that go well beyond Social Security and account numbers, like account credentials, health data not covered by HIPAA, and precise geolocation data. Fourth, to ensure accountability and deterrence, the law should authorize strong remedies, both civil penalties and redress, require oversight by qualified personnel reporting to the highest levels of the organization, and give full enforcement authority, not just to the FTC, but to the state attorneys general. Finally, if the law is really strong enough and the states can fully enforce it, I don't think we weaken protections at all by preempting state laws and foregoing a private right of action. In fact, we gain a strong, consistent standard that can be enforced nationwide by over 51 law enforcement agencies working in tandem. However, given the chasm that continues to exist on private rights of actions in particular, there are middle grounds to consider, as I discuss in my written testimony. Thank you for having me here today, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Ms. Rich. Mr. Felton, Professor Felton, is that right?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much for being here, and thank you for your work.
Thank you. Chair Cantwell, Ranking Member Wicker, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm testifying today in my personal capacity. A few years ago, researchers discovered that many widely sold webcams had been set up by their manufacturers with weak passwords like admin, guest, and 1234. Anyone who knew or guessed these passwords could control the camera. The consequence was that many Americans had webcams in their homes that could be turned on and viewed across the internet by bad actors. Then, a group of hackers automated the process of scanning the internet for vulnerable webcams and installing malware on them. By doing this, they took control of hundreds of thousands of devices all over the internet, and they operated those compromised devices under centralized control in what was dubbed the Mirai botnet. Mirai was used to launch some of the largest denial-of-service attacks seen to that time, including one against an infrastructure provider that knocked many sites offline for hours. It knocked out Twitter, Reddit, and Netflix, among others. A single and simple careless practice had led to a cascade of harm. And there was little that consumers could have done to protect themselves. The FTC later brought an enforcement action against D-Link, a prominent webcam maker, requiring it to change its practices. My written testimony summarizes another similar case, and I could have included many more. It's a distressingly common story. Consumers, unable to protect themselves, rely on a company to take adequate precautions. The company fails to do so. Intruders exploit that failure. Consumers are harmed, and an FTC enforcement follows. I had the privilege of serving as the FTC's first chief technologist about 10 years ago. The FTC's staff and leadership were and are smart, diligent, and dedicated to protecting consumers. But they simply don't have the tools they need to fully address today's data security enforcement challenges. I would respectfully suggest 3 steps that Congress might take to further empower the FTC. First, as others have advocated, Congress can allow civil penalties for first-time violations of Section 5 of the FTC Act. The lack of first-time penalties makes the FTC Act a weak deterrent, and it tempts a company to gamble that it won't face enforcement, or if it does, it can go ahead with unfair practices and then clean up its act after the first enforcement. For example, D-Link paid no penalties in the FTC's webcam enforcement. A second step Congress might take is to authorize a data security rulemaking so the FTC can clarify what is expected of companies. Today, most enforcements rely on Section 5, which is broad but not specific. The FTC has created a body of case law through its enforcements and public statements, but more specificity would better protect consumers and help companies better understand what's expected of them. A good structure would cover both internal controls and responsibility in the spirit of the GLBA safeguard rule, and also require basic best practices that are already widespread at well-managed companies, such as keeping up to date on security patches. My written testimony offers a longer list of suggested provisions. A third step Congress might take is to increase the FTC's resources for data security and technology, and to create a new technology-focused bureau in some form. When I joined the FTC in 2011 as its first chief technologist, the agency was just starting to build its workforce of technologists. The need for more technology expertise was clear. And although the FTC has increased its capacity to hire and work with technologists over the 9 years since my term ended, there's still a long way to go. Government can't match the salaries or working conditions available to top technologists in the private sector. But the FTC can find and recruit outstanding technologists who are motivated by the agency's mission of protecting Americans. I know these motivated technologists exist because I have met many of them and helped some of them get jobs at the FTC. Skilled technologists will come to the FTC, and they'll stay as long as they believe they're empowered as full partners in fulfilling the agency's mission. This requires building a community of practice and establishing career paths for technologists in the FTC so that they can develop their talents and can hope to rise to high levels in the agency staff if their performance merits it. The key is to activate the virtuous cycle where successful recruiting increases the team's impact on the mission, and the impact on the mission attracts top talent to join the team. The successful FTC of the future is one that has stronger authority, increased resources, and greater technological capability. The FTC is ready to grow into this role, and I thank the committee for your work on empowering the FTC to do this on behalf of American consumers. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, and I knew there was something there, Dr. Felton. I thought it was Dr. Felton, and I should have known that because it's the University of Washington that you graduated from, so.
Indeed.
Thank you for that. We'll ask you more about the technology aspect of this, because I do think the workforce is a very big issue. Ms. Tomarello, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Chair Cantwell, Ranking Member Wicker, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Kate Tomarello, and I am the Executive Director of Engine, a nonprofit that works with a nationwide network of thousands of startups to advocate for pro-innovation, pro-entrepreneurship policies. Most of the current technology policy debates focus on concerns about how the largest players handle or mishandle consumer data. But startups are critical contributors to innovation and economic and job growth in the U.S., and they have a unique perspective and need. A data security framework that accounts for the breadth and diversity of the startup ecosystem, sets clear, consistent expectations, and protects responsible actors from unwarranted legal and compliance costs in worst-case scenarios. For many startups, data security is a business imperative. Startups often don't have the name recognition or long-standing relationship with consumers that larger companies do. While high-profile data breaches of large corporations take up headlines and congressional attention, those companies live to see another day. For a startup, one data breach can drive away users and investors and ruin a company. Startups have to constantly balance competing goals while building out a successful product or service. One of the many things they have to consider is securing user data. In fact, many startups see privacy and security as a competitive advantage and use strong security measures as a way to differentiate themselves from others in the industry. But every startup has to grapple with the fact that it could be the victim of a data breach, as there are at least 1,000 every year, and unintentional errors can still happen at responsible companies. The startup ecosystem isn't a monolith, and each company's risk assessment and security measures are going to look different. A two-person startup collecting non-sensitive data from a handful of users will have a very different risk profile than a larger company collecting sensitive data from thousands of users. At the same time, a new and small startup won't have the resources to spend on compliance and security measures that a larger company will. Being responsible stewards of user data will look different for every company, and federal data security policy needs to recognize that. As Aaron Vick, a startup advisor from Jackson, Mississippi, told us, smart and helpful data security policy should promote flexible security practices, not make life harder for startups when they're victims of data breaches. And if a startup is a victim of a data breach, it has to spend its very limited time and resources detecting, mitigating, and investigating the breach, which can cost tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars. By contrast, the average seed stage startup has about $55,000 to spend per month, a sum that needs to cover salaries, equipment, research, development, marketing, and more. And since the vast majority of startups do not yet have outside funding, many startups have significantly less than $55,000 a month to spend. A complicated regulatory and legal regime makes a disastrous situation for a startup worse in the wake of a data breach. Congress should create a federal framework that gives startups clarity on the measures they need to implement to protect consumer data and clarity on the steps they need to take if they do suffer a data breach. A federal framework should also create certainty that startups won't face regulatory and legal burdens if they do suffer a data breach despite their precautions. The current patchwork of state laws provides unclear data security standards on the front end and varying or even conflicting requirements in the wake of a breach, which creates ambiguity and uncertainty for startups. For example, in notifying users of a breach, Michigan law requires companies to describe the incident that led to the breach, while Massachusetts prohibits notices containing that sort of information. And because startups almost always have users in multiple states, the first step of notifying users of a data breach can involve hunting down additional user data the company might not otherwise have or need to determine where users are located and which state laws are implicated. In addition to having to navigate state laws, startups also have to worry about being sued in multiple states. A lawsuit, especially one where an organization's data security measures are dissected in a lengthy discovery process, can easily cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. This approach to enforcement also opens up the door for courts to issue inconsistent rulings about what security measures are adequate under the law. It also creates opportunities for malicious or misguided lawsuits where, for instance, a startup is sued by a competitor or faces a nuisance value lawsuit. Again, a federal framework should create clarity and consistency and restrict the opportunities for bad faith litigation. One bright spot in the current policy landscape is where state laws incentivize security measures by, for instance, easing compliance burdens if a data breach impacts only encrypted data. Encryption is one of the most effective ways startups can secure their users' data. As Ben Golub, CEO of Atlanta-based Storage, explained, The widespread use of encryption is key to protecting sensitive consumer, financial, healthcare, and research data from compromise by us or by bad actors, and these are the kinds of measures we should be encouraging. Congress should create a federal framework that incentivizes strong security measures that make sense for startups and their unique risk profiles, allows room for the universe of responsible security measures to grow and adapt as the threat landscape evolves, and creates consistency and certainty for responsible actors, including ensuring they won't face unnecessary burdens in the event of a data breach. We appreciate the committee's attention to this issue and the broader effort to create a federal privacy framework. To quote Tony Hike, CEO of Minneapolis-based Theratech, "If lawmakers are going off an assumption that every business is trying to do bad things, then they don't understand startups. There will be a few bad actors, but legislating for the lowest common denominator is not the right approach." Thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Thank you for all the testimony today. I want to do as we did at our last hearing, try to figure out whether we have a lot of commonality. So if you could just kind of be brief on answers, if you could. Do you all support an FTC, Privacy and Data Security Bureau?
Yes.
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 Do you support first-time penalties? If somebody knows the answer, go
Oh,
ahead.
yes.
Yes.
Yes, if there are clear rules of the road.
Same.
Okay.
Yeah. Take your pick.
Do you on this technology issue, one of the key things, Dr. Felton, is to get technology workforce at the FTC who understands these issues. Ms. Tomarello is bringing up a point about small businesses, but I venture to guess, knowing what I've known about the past cases at the FTC, is that the people who are the breach and privacy violators are those who don't have a workforce within their organizations or understand their responsibility as it relates to data and the threat. I don't know if Mr. Lee might see the same thing, juxtaposed to startups who are very sophisticated technology players, because they wouldn't be in that business if they weren't very sophisticated technology players. So what we're seeing is an absence of technology expertise at these firms. Is that correct? The ones that are getting the violations, and Ms. Rich, you can join in here too. Is that what we saw at the FTC?
I wouldn't totally agree with that. Sometimes that was the case, but sometimes it was simply a failure to prioritize it or put the investment there. So
That's exactly my point.
Yes.
Companies have a lot of data.
Yeah.
And then they don't prioritize.
Right,
Or have.
exactly.
Which I consider somewhat being sophisticated if you
Yeah.
have that level of data.
Yeah.
So that is the point. So that's who was violating the FTC's actions against people were people who weren't taking that responsibility seriously.
exactly.
Yes, often it's a failure to take sufficient care, meaning not recruiting the technology people you need, not managing them carefully, not making this an issue that is on the radar of senior officials in the company. That's what leads to sloppiness and corner cutting, which ultimately is the cause of a lot of these problems.
So, Mr. Lee, your reports show that we had a hearing more than a year ago about Equifax and its breach, which was simply not applying a patch. That was a known solution. But you're saying we're beyond that even. We're beyond the people just not doing patches, because now the attacks, because people understand the amount of money and resources here, are much more sophisticated.
We've gone from a period of data acquisition. So let's think of Equifax as sort of the high point where bad guys wanted to accumulate as much data as they could from as many sources as they could find. Now we're into a period where they're using the data they've already stolen. So we've gone from a period of theft to a period of fraud. So a lot of what you're seeing in the last year has been circumstances where they'll use that to either perpetrate a phishing attack that can lead to ransomware, can lead to that kind of information. When you have a login and password from an organization, that can lead directly into a ransomware attack, because they don't need to breach your system. They can go in with a login and password. Or you have what you saw with unemployment, where you can pretend to be individuals and open up accounts or take over accounts. So we've gone from acquisition to fraud. Now, that doesn't mean they're not still trying to acquire, and they're not still using our own tools against us. We don't patch fast enough. We have legacy software that hasn't been updated or replaced in some cases, decades. But certainly, you have a lot of legacy software out there in organizations. It's time-consuming, it's expensive, I understand that. But it still has to be done, and that leads to the attacks like what you saw at Excellion.
And so, Dr. Felton, what do you need to require of the companies as it relates to the level of technical sophistication that they should have in dealing, if they are, let's just say, dealing with large volumes of public content?
Yeah, the bar is certainly higher for them, needs to be higher for them than it has been because the threat is higher. It requires staff. It requires especially a sophisticated and strategic approach to managing these systems, and it requires consistent execution. Companies need to be willing to, in some cases, spend money, in some cases, encounter inconvenience to upgrade legacy systems and so on, in order to protect things. Because what the community has learned over and over is that a single failure to patch one thing or to upgrade something when it needs to be there to make sure that some digital door is locked can lead to a huge breach.
Thank you. Senator Wicker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let's go down the line on some other questions. Do you all support inclusion of a data security requirement in a federal data privacy law?
Yes.
I wouldn't want to hold it up for what is turning out to be a very difficult process of negotiating a privacy law, which is very broad. So if you could enact a data security law on its own, it would substantially improve data protection in this country.
Yes.
Dr. Phil?
Yes.
Okay. Agree or disagree with this statement? We'll start with Mr. Tomarello and go backwards. A preemptive federal law does not mean a weaker law.
Agree.
Yes, it's not necessarily weaker.
If it's a strong law, it's not weaker.
Yes.
Okay, and let me ask you, Ms. Rich, on your statement, your oral statement about a private right of action, is that consistent with your written statement, or have you changed your position? I'm just not sure we all heard you correctly there.
My position, I thought, was consistent between my statements.
Okay, well, just tell us what it is.
Is that if it's a strong law with strong with strong remedies, resources for the FTC, state AG enforcement, a private right of action is not necessary. However, if it just continues to be this very difficult issue, there are middle grounds to consider. But I don't personally think it's necessary. Okay,
good. Now, on page 7 of Mr. Lee's testimony, he states, quote, in the environment where we operate today, some states are more aggressive in protecting their citizens than others, resulting in disparate impacts for the same crime based on where you live. Victims and businesses alike are well served when everyone knows the rules and faces the same consequences. End quote. Mr. Lee, that's an argument for preemption, isn't it?
Not necessarily. What we believe is that victims need options, and we're here today advocating for victims and the redress that's available to them. But what we see today is in every part of the process, whether it is the enforcement of whatever a state has deemed to be a data breach, all the way to the form of the notice and the substance of the notice. We're so across the board in so many different areas, it's very difficult for anyone to have any kind of understanding, if you're the business or you're the victim, of what it is that I can do to protect myself, or what is it that somebody is going to do to protect me.
Okay, you may want to enlarge on that on the record. Ms. Rich, I think Mr. Lee's written statement makes a case for preemption. Do you agree?
Trying to get us to argue?
Well, I'm trying to compare and contrast.
I think that the case for preemption, if the law is strong and all the state AGs enforce it, is very strong.
And that would prevent situations in which the same crime, based on where you live, has disparate impacts, would it not?
Yes.
Now, okay, Mr. Lee, I think Senator Cantwell and I think she'll give us a little leeway here. I think we're interested in a ranking of who's doing a good job. Now, I think what I understand you to say is you think there are just as many breaches in the United States as there are in the EU. They're just not being reported, and the difference is grossly, it's just obvious. Is that correct? And also, which data security laws are doing a really, really good job, and how can you prove that?
Great question.
I just think Senator Cantwell wanted me to ask that question.
Well, so to answer to both of you then, we do believe that it is obvious. We know because of the disparate nature of state regulations and state laws. What is a breach in one state is not a breach in another state. That in and of itself tells us that we're not having uniform reporting. I can give you two examples of large breaches that has impacted millions of people, but there's never been a single data breach because the organization deemed it doesn't apply to us. Now that's being litigated. We're going to find out if it applies to them, but their position is we had a breach, we were attacked, we had a ransomware attack, but we are not responsible for notifying any victims because we were just holding the data of our customers.
Must that be reported in one state and not another?
Could
and
be.
Must that be reported in the European Union and not in half the states?
That would be correct. There are states that do not require that.
Which state has the best law in your judgment?
Actually, Maine has a tremendous data breach law and a tremendous data breach reporting system. We get some of our very best data from the state of Maine. There are a number of states that have very good laws. Obviously, California, with the genesis of data breach laws being in California, they have a very strong law. New York has a very strong law. New York has very strong regulations underneath that.
And there are results to prove this.
Yes, sir.
Can I make just a quick comment? I think what's missing is data security. Data breach is great. Data breach notification laws are great. They create accountability, but they put the burden back on consumers to protect themselves. And what I thought we were talking more about here was having a data security standard to prevent breaches in the first place. And that's critical.
Senator Baldwin is next. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to focus a little bit on the security issues that Chair Cantwell brought up that resulted in the big breaches. So things as simple as failure to install a software patch or failure to encrypt user information. We know the Equifax breach was possible because the company failed to apply a patch. And the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attackers infiltrated a virtual private network account that didn't use multi-factor authentication, which is a basic cybersecurity tool. Dr. Felton, in light of that reality, how should we be thinking about best incentivizing companies to do what should frankly be common sense cybersecurity practices?
Well, I think there is by now a well-established list of basic practices, including the ones you mentioned, and I suggest a longer list in my written testimony. But in my view, a rulemaking might require companies to follow those basic practices. In addition to the process and accountability, internal control considerations that will help to protect against more sophisticated attackers and more subtle errors. These baseline practices, I think, ought to be required.
Ms. Tomarello, you talked in your testimony about the fact that small businesses don't have the same resources to ensure compliance with data security requirements. And frankly, if we don't expect a major company like Colonial Pipeline to take the basic steps on data security, do you think it is unfair to expect a company with perhaps only a few staff or no in-house IT expertise to succeed where large and well-resourced companies have failed? That's rhetorical. Let me just ask specifically, how do you think Congress can ensure that smaller businesses engage in appropriate data security practices, and how should small business, the carrots and sticks for small businesses be different than those of large businesses that are well-resourced?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I think, first and foremost, the vast majority of startups want to do the right thing, and currently they're stuck trying to figure out what exactly the right thing is. And so clear, consistent guidelines, whether through an FTC rulemaking or elsewhere, just saying, here is the menu of options that count as responsible security practices, and if you do these, we know that we can't prevent 100% of cyber attacks, but this is what responsible behavior looks like, and this is what you should model after. I think that would be a huge step up for startups that want to do the right thing, but again, just don't know what it is. And I would hope that any kind of menu of options provided by, for instance, an FTC rulemaking would account for scale and size and resources. Some of the things you mentioned in your first question are low-hanging fruit, and a startup can easily do them. It's just needing to know that that's enough. And so I think there's a way to create a framework that allows flexibility but still provides startups with the certainty they need.
Yeah. Well, speaking of resources, I think there's an agreement that the Federal Trade Commission does not have sufficient resources and staff today to handle the issues related to data security and data breaches. I wonder if you can, Dr. Felton and Ms. Rich, talk about what kind of additional needs the agency has if Congress were to expand its authority on data security.
So in terms of staffing of technologists, I think the agency is on the order of 10 professional technologists who are working in the mission side of the agency right now. And I think with resources, the FTC could reasonably use 50 to 60 people in those roles.
In addition to help attract technologists, there have actually been a few serious problems that have been identified by former technologists at the agency other than Ed. One is there's no career path, as Ed talked about, but another is that there are odd, very rigid and outdated ethics rules governing what technologists can do when they leave the FTC that end up meaning that if they ever worked on a case involving Google, they can never work on any other case involving Google. So it's a big disincentive, and some articles have been written about it. In terms of what the FTC needs, it's not just money, it's authority. I worked for years with Section 5, trying to bring privacy and data security cases, and they're really tough because there's so many gaps. Section 5 doesn't even allow you to prescribe practices. It only allows you to get an order against a company that already engaged in negligent practices. And it doesn't cover certain entities, and we talked about the civil penalties, et cetera. So there just needs to be a law that allows the FTC to hang its hat on it and hold companies accountable.
And I agree with the point about overly rigid conflict of interest rules.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Blunt?
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Rich, I want to get to another topic here. You mentioned in your testimony that examples of data were account credentials, health data not covered by HIPAA, and precise geolocation data. Senator Schatz and I, both on this committee, worked in the last Congress to try to get more attention to facial recognition standards. I wonder if you'd talk about that, and then if anybody else has an opinion on the use of this data and how and the lack of standards for collecting that kind of data that's out there. Everything from whether you're on a screen and looking at something and you're recognized facially, or you're walking through a drugstore. There's all kinds of this out there, and wonder what you're thinking about it as one of the things we should be concerned about.
Absolutely. I didn't happen to mention biometric data in my testimony, but it's absolutely part of the class of sensitive data that should be protected by any data security law. It also has a lot of privacy issues associated with it. And right now, other than the FTC Act and the extent to which it falls, for example, under HIPAA, which is still only covers a segment of health data, there's really no federal law that mandates security for biometric data.
All right, Mr. Felton?
Facial recognition particularly is an area that poses a lot of risks for consumers. Because of the way that facial images can be captured at a distance and used without consent or even awareness of the consumer. So I think it is an area that requires special attention, even relative to the already serious other security issues.
Mr. Lee?
They've certainly made great points about all the issues of capture. From our perspective is, if your biometric is somehow compromised, you can't change your biometric. You can't change your fingerprint. You can't change your face, your retina scan, your voice print. So we need to be very careful about how we protect that kind of data, and we have to have very specific ways of helping people whose identities are compromised when that biometric data is indeed compromised. And we don't really have a good framework for that today.
Ms. Tomarello?
Thank you. I think definitely biometric data, including facial recognition data, should be considered sensitive and should face heightened privacy and security requirements. I do think we would want to be careful not to completely eliminate the opportunities to use it in innocuous and innovative ways, but totally recognize there is a bigger threat here, and it makes sense to put extra precautions around it.
Well, you know, one thing people don't want is walking through a grocery store and then suddenly start getting ads for products. So you get a little of that by looking up anything while you're in the grocery store from the geolocation side of this, but also from whether it's a grocery store or whatever else. While I've got Ms. Rich and Mr. Felton here, the FTC, you both really well grounded there, is trying to move toward more open hearings. Your view of whether that's the challenges there and whether that's a good idea or not.
I don't believe the FTC is sharing non-public information in those open hearings, so I see nothing wrong with it. There has been some controversy about whether all the information that's needed has been circulated prior to the open meetings, but I think being more open is a perfectly legitimate thing to do.
Mr. Felton?
Ensuring that non-public information is not shared at those hearings, if we assume that, then I think this is a good idea. The transparency about what it is that the commissioners are concerned about and openness to the public is really useful in a lot of different areas. So I think for the commission to do an appropriate part of its work in public is a positive step.
Seem to be some early transition questions about how to give notice and how much notice would be necessary, and if notice itself sort of takes away from looking at what the commission's really talking about. But I may want to follow up with the both of you. Is any, I don't know, I think this is pretty much an FTC question. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you. Senator Tester?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank you for having this hearing, and I want to thank the folks who have testified today. I appreciate your testimony and your expertise. I really don't know where to start, so we'll start here. I'm going to start with you, Mr. Lee. when we're talking about data breaches and the potential for identity theft, has anybody done any work to find out how much of this identity theft information is coming from the private sector and how much is coming from government agencies?
We actually track the source of information based on the publicly noticed data breach reports.
Yep.
So we can tell you, you know.
Can you give me any sort of statistics on data breaches and how often? I'm talking about, I don't know, severe is in the eyes of the beholder, but how many are happening in government versus business?
So let's just look at this quarter.
Yeah.
Which was completed last week. There were 446 data breaches. 21 of those were from government agencies.
Okay. And so we are basically talking in today's hearing, though I assume on the private sector businesses, correct? Although they're all important. But we're talking about empowering the FTC. And I wouldn't think the FTC has power over the Veterans Administration, but who knows? I want to clarify some things up, but it's not to get you and Ms. Risch to fight. But you had said that some of the states that had strong laws remain California and New York. Is that from a notification standpoint, or is that from a data security standard standpoint?
It's actually from both. And one of the things that you're seeing at the state level is this convergence of what historically has been three silos. We've had privacy laws as one silo, we've had identity management as one, and then we've had cybersecurity. And there was very little cross-pollination. But now what we're seeing is that as states are beginning to adopt stronger laws, there are actually cybersecurity, privacy, and identity elements in all of those laws.
Yeah, so and this may be an unfair question because once again, the viability of the law is in the eye of the beholder, but would you say that half the states have adequate security laws, or 3/4, 30 out of 50, well, however you want to do it?
Well, every law is helpful. But we've gone through a period of transition where a lot of the states have sort of caught up to more common kind of data. A lot of the states, probably about half, don't recognize biometric data.
Would you agree, not to get you to fight, but would you agree with that, Ms. Risch?
According to the state legislative website, half the states have data security laws.
Oh, and half have none at all?
All of the states have breach notification laws.
Okay, all right.
Yes.
And I might be able to get to that if time goes on. This is a question for Kate Tomarello. Sorry if I botched your name. But there was an answer to one of the questions that said what the FTC needs is the authority to prescribe practices. Doesn't matter where I believe. Well, actually it does if we pass a law. But as a representative of the startups, how do you feel about that?
I think the FTC could be empowered to set out, a menu of options, right? Not every cybersecurity and data security practice is going to make sense for each company, but there are things that everyone should be doing, and there are certainly things that lots of folks that handle sensitive data should be doing, or folks that handle a lot of data should be doing. And so having a flexible framework that allows companies to pick and choose the things that make sense for their companies.
Okay. So let me give you an example, and I don't know, I think the name of the company was D-Link, Professor, isn't that correct? I don't know if they're a startup, I don't know if they've been around a long time, but it would seem to me the FTC should say, clean up your act or we're gonna fine you till you don't exist anymore. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think the D-Link example is a great example of not just sensitive data, but kind of sensitive technical capabilities being baked in, and it would make sense for the FTC to have especially prescriptive ideas there.
So they could be very prescriptive, is what you're saying?
For a company handling sensitive data and sensitive technical capabilities.
All right. So this is just for my curiosity, Ms. Risch. And by the way, I'm not picking on anybody. I appreciate all your testimony very, very much. But could you give me the definition of non-sensitive data versus sensitive data? And if not you, we'll turn to the professor.
I think that people regard simple name and address these days, since it's out in the public domain, as fairly non-sensitive.
Let me ask you this. I'm a farmer in my real life, and I drive down the road, and there's a implement behind me that has a computer on it that's collecting everything that I do, how much seed I put in the ground. I don't use fertilizer, but if they use fertilizer, they could do that. They can, I mean, all sorts of data. And some people don't think that that's sensitive data. Do you think that's sensitive data?
I actually don't think the distinction is that relevant, because if you have a scalable data security program, you're going to provide security for all your data. You just may provide more security for data that
I understand that.
Yeah.
But the question becomes, for me, is the beauty's in the eye of the beholder. I think that that data is sensitive, and I don't want anybody else to have it, even though my name isn't attached to it. I don't want people to have it because the way computers work this day, they can figure out who's doing it. And so, go ahead.
I think the issue is that companies have limited amount of money, or many companies, especially the one Kate represents. And you should be taking care of all your data and trying to make sure it isn't breached. But when you have, when it's something, when a system is going to cost a lot of extra money to protect something in a really, really secure way, you want to make sure it's the really sensitive stuff.
The good
like
stuff.
kids
Thank you.
or
Thank
health
you.
or, yeah.
I'm sorry I ran over,
Yeah,
Madam
Thank
Chair.
you,
Sorry.
Senator Fisher, and then Senator Klobuchar. Senator Fisher, are you available?
Thank you, Senator Cantwell, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. So much of our daily lives and work shifted on the online space during the COVID-19 pandemic, and this shift online also led to a spike in ransomware attacks and targeted our work patterns, how they were changing. I'm sure many members of this panel know the local companies and organizations in their states that have been impacted by ransomware. Just a couple of days ago, a company based in Lincoln, Nebraska that hosts several online auctions for farm equipment, livestock, and land was hit by ransomware attack, and the company had to take all of its sites offline. It's been very concerning for me to see the rise in these attacks, especially in the ag industry, which drives Nebraska's economy and makes up 1/5 of our nation's economy. But no sector has been immune from these attacks. Ms. Tomarello, how do we ensure any government-led solutions are responsive to the cyber across industries, particularly with the increase in ransomware attacks?
Thank you for the question, Senator. Like I said, I think giving the FTC authority to issue a menu of options where a company can recognize, okay, I'm in this sector, I handle this kind of data, these are my resources, here's what makes sense, would allow a model that scales not just across the tech sector, but to your point, across all sectors, because at this point, data security problems aren't just in the tech sector. Every business, online or offline, has data, and making sure there's a solution that works for them will ensure that we protect consumers not just in one part of the economy, but in the entire economy.
Thank you. Mr. Felton, how do you believe that cybersecurity policy should address critical sectors such as agriculture and communications or energy?
Well, it's certainly true, as you said, Senator, that there is no sector that is immune from these issues, immune from ransomware or other sort of data security considerations. One thing that I think is important to do is to make sure that the services and products that companies in these sectors use when they outsource some of their functions are providing the protection that they ought to be providing. So ensuring that the division of responsibilities between a supplier and a company that is using a product or service are clear, so that responsibility for these problems doesn't fall between the cracks is very important. And that's one thing that legislation or a regulation could help to clarify.
Okay, thank you. As we saw with Equifax's neglected patching policy, ensuring timely updates and patches is important for guarding against known cyber vulnerabilities. But keeping software up to date isn't a simple cure-all to ward off breaches. The solar wind cyber attack showed us all too clearly that software updates themselves can be compromised. Ms. Rich, As we look to create a solid basis for policy around data security and accountability, how do we also work toward the need to create more trust throughout the software supply chains?
Professor Dr. Felton just talked about, there really does need to be accountability through the supply chain, which really doesn't exist right now. So when you share data, you need to make sure you're sharing it with people who can handle it responsibly. You need to make sure you're not giving them data that is subject to controls without passing along those controls. So that cascading set of responsibility is very important. I want to also mention, though, that we've talked a lot about, Kate has talked about a menu of options that the FTC could create. It's very important that whatever you do pass here is enforceable. So that's why in my testimony I talk about process-based requirements that are enforceable, coupled with more detailed guidance that's nimble that the FTC could issue on an annual basis that responds to, up-to-date protections and technologies, that gives that menu, but there needs to be an enforceable law or rule underlying it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for not only today's hearing, but the subcommittee and full committee hearing yesterday. We're on the move in commerce, and we're on the cutting edge, as all of you are, in discussing the issues of our day, which is what do we do about data? What do we do about privacy rules? And as I argued yesterday, we simply cannot, and I appreciate Senator Cantwell's leadership in the privacy area, we cannot have this gigantic change in our economy like anything we've ever seen in the last few decades. Some of it good, some of it bad. Some incredible innovations, like the Fitbit I'm wearing right now. But also, as we know, one of the jobs of government, number one job, is to keep people safe. And as we heard yesterday, that's not always happening, as we hear from these cyber attacks. So we need to make our laws as sophisticated as the companies in our economy. And that means upgrading our laws and updating them. And so I appreciate you being here today. I think we need a national privacy law that creates digital rules of the road. And we need the resources for our agencies to enforce them. They're two separate things, but you can't have one without the other. I joined Senator Cantwell and Shata Markey in introducing the comprehensive privacy legislation to ensure that consumers can access and control how their personal data is being used. Do you all agree that consumers should have the ability to control their own data? Is that agreement from all of you?
Yes.
Okay. Everyone else?
I think a privacy law should go further than consumer control, which is notice and choice, which we've seen is problematic. It should provide more substantive protections as well.
Thank you. I think one other thing that was interesting was recently when Apple gave their customers a choice about protecting their data or not. And what was it? You can maybe explain it better for me here, but 75% of their customers is the number out there, chose not to have their data used. And it just shows us what would happen if this was available with all platforms. Professor Felton, in your testimony, you note that we can empower the FTC by authorizing data security rulemaking. Why is this rulemaking so important to protect consumers' data?
For a couple of reasons. First, that it provides more specificity than is available through the current structure of the FTC Act, so that companies have a clear idea of what they're expected to do. And it can also help to clarify ideas such as, issues such as the responsibility of suppliers in a supply chain, so that there's not ambiguity about what companies are expected to do, and therefore there can be strong enforcement if they fail to do it.
Thank you. And Ms. Rich, the bill would also increase transparency and require companies to maintain certain standards for their data security. In your testimony, you note that it can be a problem when companies over-collect or over-store data. How could a federal privacy law help with this issue?
I believe that both bills they're a little different, but they both talk about data minimization and reducing unnecessary collection and storage of data, and that would be a very important component of a data security law.
And are you aware that one of the proposals out there as we debate this Build Back Better agenda and making our laws sophisticated and putting people first, some of it is putting some funding into the FTC for privacy, as well as from my position as chair of the antitrust subcommittee, we hope additional resources on antitrust at both the FTC and the Department of Justice. Could you talk about how important that is to have those resources? Yes, the Privacy Bureau, I know Senator Cantwell asked all of you that question, but also the resources for these agencies to do their jobs.
The FTC's resources in privacy and also antitrust, but I'm less familiar with that, is minuscule compared to other comparable enforcers abroad or even sectoral enforcers here in the United States. 45 to 50 attorneys, that was the maximum when I was there working on privacy. So resources are a critical piece of this, as well as authority.
I keep reminding people these are the biggest companies the world has ever known. Several of them are over $1 trillion, and we're trying to fight this with duct tape and Band-Aids. The other thing I like to remind people is in the competition policy area, when we add resources to that, and I'm sure the same could be said of some of the privacy work, we actually bring in money for the government because they're doing their jobs and they're enforcing the laws. And so we are literally, as you note, Ms. Rich, these agencies are a shadow of their former selves, even during Ronald Reagan. That's why we have long neglected them. And there are, in the competition area, deals that Bill Baer, that former head of antitrust under President Obama, said shouldn't be getting out of the boardroom. And I could think the same could be said of policies that are hurting people's privacy. Because if we're not there on the other side, you know, creating that safety for people and making clear we're going to be tough and strong, then they're just going to push the max, as we saw yesterday from the whistleblower. They're just going to target kids with bad anorexia content and the like, or let the algorithms do that and not do anything about it. That's what's going to keep happening unless we strengthen our side of the table. So thank you very much for your work. And I have some questions on cyber threats and the like, which I will be putting on the record. Thank you.
Senator Cruz, are you ready? Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Welcome to each of the witnesses. There seems to be pretty broad agreement across the witnesses today that the way we currently handle the issue of data security at the federal level is at best a patchwork and a problem made worse by a patchwork of different state laws across the country. At the federal level, there's a multitude of rules, regulations, guidances, not to mention outdated statutes, some of which were enacted at a time when cars were a brand new technology. And together that creates confusion and uncertainty among companies and consumers and often leaves regulators powerless to address genuine harm and leaves the American public significantly vulnerable. I want to start with a simple question to all the witnesses. Let's say Congress can somehow get to yes on a sensible data security law. Who should be responsible for it? The FTC? Somebody else?
The FTC has the experience and the expertise in this area and the will to protect consumers in this area. It's been trying to do that for 20 years. It's absolutely the right agency, but with the resources it needs and the authority it needs.
Any disagreement on that question?
No, the FTC has had a mission of consumer protection for its whole history. It is the right agency for this.
So if the FTC has the principal authority, should the FTC also have the authority to harmonize regulations and guidance across federal agencies? So for example, should the FTC be able to tell the TSA that its cybersecurity regulations need to change one way or another, or tell HHS that it needs to beef up minimum standards for what is or isn't HIPAA compliant?
I think that's putting the FTC in a very difficult position, and I would not recommend that. I would say that you should do that. You, as a body, should decide how the regulations and laws harmonize.
Anyone have a different perspective? So there should be no regulatory role for harmonizing regulations.
No, there certainly should be discussions about harmonizing it. I just don't think the little FTC should be the one telling all the other agencies what to do, that they're equal players, and that's something maybe OMB could do or Congress could do.
Let's focus then on how Congress and/or the FTC strikes the right standard that has the substance needed to be effective while also the flexibility to be applicable to companies with very different risk profiles. What do the witnesses think the guidance should be on that?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I think the FTC could issue kind of a menu of options where startups and bigger companies and other organizations can decide what makes the most sense for them, knowing that they are meeting some kind of minimum standard as set by the FTC, so that if something does go wrong, because again, not all data breaches can be prevented, they have done the right thing. And again, startups just want to do the right thing and would appreciate guidance on what that right thing is.
I think there are some baseline practices that companies across the board ought to be following, and some of those are listed in my written testimony. But beyond that, I think it would depend, or it ought to depend, on the amount and sensitivity of consumer data that a particular company is dealing with. So companies with more or more sensitive data could be held to a more stringent standard.
And in my testimony, I proposed that there be a process-based law that's scalable, similar to the safeguards rule, the original safeguards rule, but maybe a little more meat on the bones of it. And then the FTC would provide congressionally mandated annual updated guidance with that menu of option that Ms. Tomarello is discussing.
And what are the risks of overregulation, of standards that are too strict, and what are the potential downsides that could come from that?
They quickly become outdated as technology changes, and then there's no chance for Congress to amend the law or rulemaking to keep pace, or they are not suited for small businesses because they're too prescriptive in terms of technologies that may not be necessary for certain small businesses.
So how do we avoid that risk?
I think by having a process-based rule that is scalable based on the size of the volume of information a company collects, the sensitivity of data, the nature of the operations, coupled with updated guidance that the FTC could issue on an annual basis or more.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Hickenlooper.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank all of you for your time. This is something that I've, having been a governor in Colorado, I'm not ignorant of. I'll start out with Ms. Tomarello. We signed into law a Colorado statute that requires reporting of security breaches of over 500 or more Colorado residents. It has to go to the Attorney General within 30 days. We also created the National Cybersecurity Center, which was and continues to be an effort to promote data security with both private and public companies. With the NCC, we launched cybersecurity for state leaders, which is a Google effort to educate, provide a training curriculum for state officials, including county commissioners and municipal folks. Obviously, timely reporting, as you guys have all said, pays a lot of different dividends. How should we think about a national reporting process? I think everyone's kind of talked about the need for it. What would you say it should look like in terms of how do we, as a small business person for many years myself, I want to start with your perspective on that.
Thank you for the question, Senator. I think first and foremost, one standard is a huge advantage for small businesses and startups. And we've talked a lot about data minimization at this hearing, and I think one of the points that gets glossed over is that if you are having to follow a state-by-state patchwork, you are having to collect information about where your users are located to figure out if those state laws are implicated. And so creating a single standard not only incentivizes better data practices at the outset by not requiring state information, it also just makes it easier if a startup is the victim of a data breach and has to jump into action without having to figure out 50 state laws. And so I think, it almost, a 30-day reporting requirement seems reasonable. It's more just about having one requirement across the board.
Right. I wasn't going to suggest that Colorado be the model, but since you put it out there. Dr. Felton, I wanted to ask you a little bit about some of these ransomware attacks that we've seen so much of. We had in May of 2020, JBS, is a large meat packer in Colorado, had a serious breach. We had a Colorado hospital that lost 5 years of electronic health records from 2012 to 2017. And it took 6 months to recover a lot of the critical health data. We've really pushed that businesses should provide security training for their employees, that they should have an incident response plan, that there should be a backup for their server data. So, I mean, obviously, as you all know, that it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. Organization or an enterprise is going to be breached. So what, in your opinion, Dr. Felton, what targeted resources can Congress provide to support businesses' data security? In other words, what can we provide?
To support businesses specifically, I think there are important educational roles that government can play. The FTC has an office that is engaged in this education for consumers and small businesses to help them understand what's out there and how to make safe decisions, giving them simple checklists of best practices and so on. It becomes more difficult when you're talking about larger organizations that face more sophisticated threats. There, I think government can help to play a convening role so that information can flow between organizations about what are the best practices and how can they protect themselves.
Right. Well, I'd probably go further than that, but I appreciate that. And Mr. Lee, I was struck that in a large part what we're talking about here is security, the most basic type, and that the traditional way that we look at security in this country has been, we have the federal government does national security, and then most of us in our local communities have our local police department is where we really look at security. And yet right now, in terms of cybersecurity, it is largely relegated to the private sector, and for individual small companies, large companies, healthcare providers, it's catch as catch can. How do you see that balance between private companies providing cybersecurity protection and clearly what I think is becoming apparent, that the public need?
It's a great question, Senator, and I would also struck by something you just said about the question of it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. It's actually a matter of how many times.
Don't say that.
Unfortunately.
Thank you.
The practical reality is the private sector and the government for their agencies are in the only position to be able to provide security and to prevent the kinds of incidents we're seeing that impact people, so create victims. So we have to have a partnership between all of the parties, beginning with government setting a standard, an enforceable standard, that then the private sector can go and implement. And they have the clear rules of the road, they know the consequences if they breach them, and they have the tools necessary to be able to implement them. If we have that system, we will reduce the number of cyber incidents, we'll reduce the number of data breaches, and we therefore will reduce the number of identity crime victims.
I think that's something we can all work toward.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you for that questioning. I'm going to ask Senator Moran's indulgence from the hearing the other day we had. There's some confusion. I'm going to talk to Senator Wicker, and we've had Commerce Committee rules pre-COVID and then COVID adoption, and now we're still in a kind of a hybrid thing where some people are logging in, remotely. So I think we have to figure out how to get back to what rules that we're going to operate under.
Exactly, and some of us log in at the start of that hearing to get in.
Well, I think we'll have, but I've asked Senator Moran for his indulgence today, given that I'm very indulgent. So we really appreciate his.
Madam Chairman.
Yeah, thank you. So Senator Blackburn, then followed by Senator Blumenthal, then Senator Moran.
Thank you so much, Madam Chairman. And to each of you, thank you. This has been such an interesting week. Yesterday we did privacy, kids' privacy in the online space, and of course with data security today. But what I want to do is break out social media from small business and other interests. And let's talk specifically, and Professor, I'm going to come to you on this first. Is there we know how social media is collecting data, they keep that data, they mine that data, then they turn around, they sell the information in that data. So should there be a special set of obligations and enforcements and penalties that we expect from those social media companies?
In my view, social media companies differ from many other companies more in degree than in type when it comes to privacy. These are among the companies that collect the most data, that use it most aggressively. And so the need for strong rules of the road and enforcement would be strongest for those companies.
So you would do a broader bill that would capture all entities. Would that be your approach?
I think a comprehensive data security framework is important, one that covers everyone, but that scales according to the volume and sensitivity of information that a particular
Ms.
entity
Rich,
has.
I see you're thinking out loud there with us.
Well, I'm nodding and I'm shivering too. It's really cold in here.
Yes,
But I agree with everything Professor Felton just said.
Okay, thank you. So one set of rules, entire internet ecosystem, one regulator, the FTC. Platforms can't boot you off. That's basically where you all are.
This is one reason the FTC needs a lot more resources. It's because when they investigate a giant company like that that's collecting a lot of data, that investigation is going to be really, really complex and take a lot of resources. But I do think it's important in this law, especially if it's going to have preemption, for the state AGs to also be able to enforce it.
Okay. All right. Ms. Tomarello, the IRS data security breach. That supposedly has data on tax returns of thousands of people and may go back as much as 15 years into a person. This is something that is a tremendous concern. We know that as of last month, the IRS is still looking at this alleged breach. But now we're hearing that the administration is wanting to propose a sharing of information, letting the IRS look at every transaction, $600 and above. And that amount of data and invasiveness that really carries a lot of privacy concerns for me. Tennesseans don't want that, and they've really been quite vocal about this. But talk about the potential issues that you see with that type invasive practice from an agency that has data security issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question, Senator. So we've thought about it, because we're focused on startups in the cryptocurrency context, because there are cryptocurrency startups who don't want data, they don't want to have the data, they want to protect the privacy and security of their users, and we're always concerned about federal rules that not only might make it so that agencies can get the data, but that require companies to keep and get the data in the first place. We've talked about data minimization. I think that's a great principle and one that should be baked into any privacy or security law, but anything that kind of counteracts that by requiring collection and storage of data in the private sector goes right up against what companies should be encouraged to do.
Okay. Madam Chairman, I'm going to stop at that. Yield my time back.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you. Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks for having this hearing and for your work on data security. I'm going to take advantage of this panel's very impressive expertise to talk a little bit about a topic we discussed yesterday in this room with Frances Haugen, the whistleblower in the Facebook documents. She spoke very powerfully and compellingly about the role that algorithms play in pushing harmful content on children. And obviously, the algorithms use data, so it's not completely unrelated. She is a data scientist and engineer with an MBA from Harvard, and she spent years working on algorithms, and her observation was that the Facebook algorithm is a kind of black box. That's my word, not hers, because nobody outside Facebook knows how it works. And we conducted an experiment, my office did, creating a 13-year-old girl on Instagram who expressed interest in weight loss and dieting and eating disorders, and she was flooded within 24 hours with accounts relating or recommendations for them to eating disorders, self-injury, and so forth. So algorithms obviously have a powerful part to play on Instagram and Facebook and social media. We're going to pursue this issue. I'm drafting legislation on it. One of her recommendations was that there be more transparency, more disclosure about how algorithms work, more oversight into this aspect of the internet. So my question to you, Professor Felton, is, and to others who want to make observation, what should we be asking of Facebook to tell us about their algorithms? What specific should we be demanding of them?
Sure. So an algorithm like Facebook's is extraordinarily complex. I think the conceptual handles one can get on it are maybe three things. One is which data go into the algorithm. What is it using? And then any issues around accuracy or nature of that data. That's number one. I think number two is what is it that the algorithm is trying to optimize or maximize? These machine learning algorithms are all trying to maximize some metric or measure of something. With Facebook, it's maybe something like engagement, how often people click or time they spend on the site. And then what are they doing to understand the consequences? It's not simple to understand the consequences of one of these complex algorithms in operation, but companies are constantly monitoring, measuring, evaluating how these things go, and getting a picture into what they're seeing internally on their dashboards or reports. Seems quite important for understanding what's going on.
I'm assuming you would agree that algorithms can be made safer in terms of protecting children and protecting data.
Absolutely.
Would you have specific recommendations based on what you know about Facebook or Instagram's algorithms on what they should be doing?
With respect to children, the obvious first question is, should children be interacting with these technologies at all, or interacting as part of the same broad system that adults are? In addition, I think the companies have at least an ethical responsibility to take special pains to understand how what they're doing impacts children. What are the behaviors of children on this site? Because it's very difficult for anyone else, such as parents, to really govern this behavior if the company is not there taking basic precautions.
Parents don't have the ability to change the algorithm, do they?
No, all they can do is look over their kids' shoulders or cut them off entirely.
And in fact, my guess is that most parents have no idea what an algorithm is or what its effect is on their children.
Even I, as a parent of a once young child, didn't really understand what these algorithms would be doing to my child. It's a lot of guesswork.
So a good place to start for Congress might well be to require greater disclosure and transparency about algorithms. And if we were to establish, for example, an oversight board, it would be the work of that board to enforce greater safety to protect children.
I think understanding is a first step, and then thinking about how to govern these algorithms is extraordinarily difficult but important.
But if Mark Zuckerberg's really serious about transparency, he would provide more disclosure about his algorithms, correct?
There is certainly more they could do in terms of disclosure, yes.
Thank you.
Can I just add that I don't think it would be very useful for the disclosure to be to consumers, because I don't think, in the same way consumers don't read privacy policies, they're not going to look at all this programming and figure out how the algorithm works. So if there's going to be oversight, I think it should be congressional oversight or agency oversight, but not disclosures to consumers unless you're able to boil it down to something consumers can really understand.
In the same way that the FDA regulates drugs or tobacco, for example, you'd need some kind of oversight agency that had that specialized knowledge.
If Congress wants to regulate this, it needs to do more than have it be an ethical obligation. Yes, there needs to be some structure in place.
Thank you.
Access to this data and information by independent researchers who truly are experts is also valuable.
Very good point. Thank you.
Senator Moran.
Chairman, thank you. Please take note of my indulgence and remember that.
I will.
I'm pleased to be here and appreciate this panel and this topic of conversation. This, Senator Blackburn said, this has been a week of useful and valuable time spent in the Commerce Committee. I don't know how to narrow my questions, and I have several, and I want to get to one in particular, and I'm saving it to the last, which is probably a mistake. But let me first of all say, Senator Shaheen and I are the appropriators for NIST. We chair the ranking Republican or back. And so my question, maybe intended for Mr. Lee, is how can Congress better equip NIST to provide effective cybersecurity guidance to organizations?
Yeah, so there's...
Well, NIST does an amazing job, as you well know, and they provide, great guidance that can form the basis of many of these enforceable standards that we're talking about. You already have some states now that are trying to make that easy to do, and if you do that, then you are relieved of some obligations and some liability under state law. So NIST is a great partner for what we've been talking about today. If we empower the FTC the way it needs to be empowered, with the resources, with the personnel, and with the mandate, it has to be in concert with NIST.
I'm also an appropriator for the FTC. Yeah. Let me ask, maybe this is for Ms. Tomarello. Our Consumer Data Privacy Act, Privacy and Security Act, we try to scale the requirements based upon size, complexity, and the resources covered, resources of the covered entity or provider, as well as the sensitivity of the data. Tell me, in formulating comprehensive data privacy policy, how can Congress properly calibrate the data security requirements to ensure that tech startups aren't harmed, that we don't stifle innovation?
Thank you for the question, Senator, and I appreciate the focus on not stifling startups and innovation. I think, guidance would have to be, or requirements would have to be nimble, and I think the suggestion of having the FTC issue annual guidance is a good one, something that allows not only the cybersecurity threat landscape evolving, taking that into account, but also kind of the capabilities of startups. As those both evolve, the guidance will need to change, and so giving the FTC rulemaking authority and then a requirement to issue updated guidance annually or something like that would be a huge step to provide startups clarity, but also evolve with changes in technology.
Maybe there's a point that you're making, which I would highlight, at least for me and others, is it's not just the nature of the regulations, not just the magnitude, but also the certainty. Certainty is hugely important. On this topic of certainty, as you and others may know, I've been engaged in negotiations, which I've answered every press person's question and every interested party's question, that we're this far apart on getting something done, but I've been saying that now for 2 years. I think what we heard yesterday, what's going on in the country, the state's enactment, international activity, means that our work is more important maybe than it was when we started. So the crux of the challenge is a desire for certainty and a nationwide standard And then the other kind of issue that comes together is a private right of action. So the two things that keep pulling us apart are these two. I would ask you, Ms. Tomarello, is there something that can be, that would be satisfactory in, if the certainty of a national standard was provided, preemption, what is the ideas that we ought to be discussing to try to find common ground on the issue of liability or private right of action?
Thank you. I think, private right of action does get to the certainty question. It's not just about
They're not separate. You're right.
Yeah, and so having courts across the country issue different rulings is a huge issue that creates another patchwork for startups to comply with, and that's kind of baked into needing certainty. So I think there are ways to scope a narrow private right of action, especially around things like whether or not they've had notice and the opportunity to fix the problems. If there are specific harms we're worried about, making sure that's what the private right of action is focused on. There are ways to scope it such that you mitigate the chance of bad faith litigation. But startups are especially vulnerable to bad faith litigation. We see it in other contexts, especially around intellectual property. And so making sure Congress is trying to put guardrails on a private right of action, I think, is really critical.
I was going to ask others this similar question, but I'm happy to do that, although my time has expired, and I don't know whether Senator Markey's become the chairman of the hearing or not.
Yep, through a miracle of a paucity of attendance, the chairmanship has devolved to me for a very brief, fleeting moment in time.
And for which you have a conflict of interest because you're the next senator to ask questions.
And I recognize myself for as much time as I might want to consume on this incredibly important subject. So let me ask, questions I've asked over and over and over again, because any comprehensive cybersecurity regime must address the unique challenges created by the Internet of Things, the IoT. And the Internet of Things includes all of the Internet-connected devices increasingly prevalent in our everyday lives, such as connected refrigerators, laundry machines, dryers, baby monitors, smart locks, with as many as 75 billion, can I say that again? 75 billion Internet of Things devices projected to be in our pockets and homes by 2025. The Internet of Things will also stand for the Internet of Threats until we protect this omnipresent technology from hacking and cyber intrusions. That's why I introduced the Cyber Shield Act with Congressman Ted Lieu, legislation to create a voluntary, can I underline that? Voluntary cybersecurity certification program for Internet of Things devices. Our bill establishes an expert advisory committee to create cybersecurity benchmarks for Internet of Things devices. Manufacturers can then voluntarily certify that their products meet these benchmarks and display this certification to the public with a Cyber Shield label akin to the Energy Star for energy-efficient appliances that will help consumers identify and purchase more secure technology. I'm very proud that President Biden included a new Internet of Things labeling pilot program that mirrors my Cyber Shield Act in his May 2021 executive order on cybersecurity. Dr. Felton, do you agree that we should make an Internet of Things labeling program a permanent component of our nation's cybersecurity safeguards by passing my bill?
Yes, I think having a permanent program of that nature would certainly be helpful. There's an old saying that the problem with many of these devices is you can't tell if it's secure by looking at the box. And having a label that can be on there that consumers can recognize and having people be able to count on that into the future would be valuable.
Okay, great. And Ms. Tomarello, same question. Would that labeling program be helpful?
Yes, absolutely. I think the fact that it's voluntary is appreciative. And then it would allow startups to compete on security and privacy by saying we are certified, which could make it easier for them to get in consumers' hands. So I appreciate the idea.
Yeah, and Energy Star works. People could just see, oh, it's less expensive and I get less efficiency out of this, energy device as well. Or when you're buying a car and say, oh, it only has 2 stars for safety and I have 3 young kids, maybe Could you have a car that has 3 or 4 or 5 stars here? You know, let me see it, just so you can have that kind of transparency. Well, the same thing is true for all Internet of Things devices. People are just going to want to know, and then they can make up their own mind. It's all voluntary, but at least they have the transparency of the information that allows them to make the decisions to protect their children or to protect their own privacy by buying a higher standard. But just leaving it to an individual consumer to figure that out is obviously ultimately going to be very difficult to navigate. And I'm also particularly concerned about cyber threats to children and teens' data, and that's why I've reintroduced my bipartisan update to the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. The bill includes key data security protections to help kids and teens safely navigate the online ecosystem. Specifically, my legislation would require children's websites and apps to employ strong safeguards against hacks, require kids' connected devices to meet robust cybersecurity standards, and require manufacturers to clearly communicate to consumers how they are protecting kids' data. So, Ms. Rich, do you agree that we should enact heightened cybersecurity protections for children and teens online?
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Felton, same question.
Yes.
Yeah, Ms. Tomarello.
Yes, as long as we're not encouraging general audience services and products to collect more information to try to suss out if they have children, as long as this is child-directed, I think that makes sense.
Child-directed, yeah, Mr. Lee.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. And so, again, that's why Senator Cassidy and I have introduced this legislation. We just carve out this special category of kids, provide them the protections, and what we do with adults, we'll see, you know, but at least for children, they should have that safe harbor, you know, to grow up and not be concerned, especially parents, of what's happening to their kids. So thank you. Let me turn and recognize the senator from Florida, Senator Scott.
Thank you. Chair, are you chair now, Markey? Are you the chair?
I have the title for a brief period of time. I'm like King John waiting for King Richard to return from the Middle East. So for the time being, I have it, yes.
Thank you. Recently, the Biden administration and Democrats in Congress have embraced a radical new policy that should terrify every American. Under Joe Biden's America, the federal government's authority would be vastly expanded. So the IRS would get a look at any account over $600. The madness doesn't stop there. This new rule from Joe Biden will also require banks to report every transaction of $600 or more. I completely oppose this disastrous proposal, full stop. But to make matters even worse, the federal government can't even be trusted to keep the data it already collects safe. As we all know, in 2016, the IRS was the subject of a massive data breach. Now, President Biden wants the IRS to have the data on the financial transactions of nearly every American family. You might expect this would come from communist China or Cuba, but a surveillance state is not something we should put up with in the United States. I've only been up here 2.5 years. I've never gotten as much feedback from my constituents. I've heard from more than 18,000 Floridians on this issue alone in 2 weeks. So here's my question. Do any of you believe the federal government is adequately prepared to protect the private financial information of millions and millions of Americans in a massive expansion of its current data holding capacity? And how can we expect hackers to not have a field day if the IRS, which is already a woefully unresponsive as a federal agency, gets this new authority? So what do y'all think?
I'm not an expert on government security. I really worked on commercial area, but being a victim of data breaches affecting the federal government as a former government employee and also working in an area where we observe a lot of government security problems, I do have concerns about the government's ability to safeguard data.
How about everybody else?
Yeah, I think there are concerns across the board about the government's availability to safeguard data.
Anybody feel comfortable with all your data being held by the federal government? Come on. There's no yeses, I guess. All right.
I think we said yes.
Every company located in Communist China is subject by law to turn over any information their Communist government demands. How can we be sure that data stored in companies based in adversarial countries like Communist China is protected?
There is a limited amount we can do, if anything, to protect that data. So we should absolutely be concerned about where our data is going and what protections exist there, both under the local law, but also in practice in those places.
Anybody else? So what limitations should we put on American tech companies that do business in Communist China to make sure that information about Americans stored in a foreign country, what sort of limitations do you all recommend?
I would, if you decided to regulate American companies and they stored US data abroad, I think technically there are legal theories for that they need to protect that data even if it's kept abroad. Implementing that, bringing enforcement against them for that is the more difficult task.
Anybody else? Thank you.
So thank you, Senator Scott. And I think Senator Rosen is
I'm here.
with us. Well,
Senator Markey.
Recognize the senator from Nevada.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Appreciate it. And like my colleagues before me, everyone is trying to work on this issue. So in order to, some of the bills that I've introduced to enhance data security, I'd like to just address one. They're aimed at strengthening our cybersecurity capacity, providing cybersecurity resources, education to small businesses, to schools, local governments. So like I said, one such bill I have, Improving Telework Cybersecurity for Small Organizations Act, that would work to strengthen the cybersecurity capacity of small organizations to defend against telework related cyber threats through collaborative guidance and support from CISA and the FTC. We know telework, of course, has increased so much because of the pandemic, and I think a lot of that is here to stay, so I just want to bring that up. But we also need to think about protecting our data through our cloud services, because as more and more of us have to store data, we want to keep it safe and secure. Adopting cloud services, we know, can strengthen data security. It's going to provide a more resilient source of data sourcing. 90% of companies have taken advantage of these benefits and they're now on the cloud. But while migrating to cloud services provides a more resilient source of data hosting, it concentrates critical data maybe in a small number of entities. Last week, leaders in the cloud computing industry created an initiative aimed at establishing trusted cloud principles, basic commitments and protections for companies that store and process their data on the cloud. So, Mr. Lee and then Dr. Felton, can you discuss the unique data security challenges facing the cloud computing industry? Mr. Lee, first.
Thank you for the question. It is an issue for victims because increasingly as we do move to the cloud, not every organization has the same level of robust security in place. So any effort to have more uniform standards around what you need to do for security would be welcome. I noted in our report from our data breach analysis from this last quarter, nearly 100 million individuals were impacted by the fact that organizations failed to add a password to their cloud environment. It is basic blocking and tackling in many cases that compromises people's information. It's the lack of basic blocking and tackling, if you will. So it is an important issue, and it is something that needs to be addressed in a way that is enforceable. So if someone does fail to add that password, not very tough, but at least add that password, then if they fail to do that, there should be some enforcement action.
Good cyber hygiene always helps. Thank you. Dr. Felton, could you address some of the unique challenges? And then I want to move on to talk about some resiliency and redundancy issues in the cloud.
Sure. There are a lot of advantages to organizations, especially smaller ones, relying on cloud services rather than trying to do things in-house. As you said, it does concentrate some of the vulnerability, but cloud companies can be central sources of more cybersecurity expertise and better practices. They can really they can really give the issue the attention that it needs. The kind of standards and coordination that you talked about, I think, are really important to make sure that not only that the cloud companies are doing what they can, but also there are clear expectations about what the responsibilities of the cloud company versus their customers are, so that things don't fall in between and get neglected.
Thank you, because I want to move on again, Dr. Felton, with the security implications, again, of a concentrated cloud service market. We don't just have cybersecurity, we also have physical security. I want to remind people the cloud is not really in space. The cloud is often warehouses and warehouses of servers. And so we have physical security to worry about. So how do we build resiliency and redundancy to minimize the downtimes and outages, not just in the cyberspace for the cloud, but also perhaps in the physical space?
Sure. Well, and as you know, there's no simple recipe for this. Redundancy is especially difficult when you're operating at this very large scale because you don't have much opportunity to try it out. It is an area that the largest cloud companies are putting a lot of attention into. They don't always succeed. We saw downtime from Facebook this week that was due to exactly the kind of failure that you were talking about. So even the biggest and most sophisticated companies don't always get this right. I do think it's something that needs attention from the companies. It's an area where government has expertise about defenses and about the threat landscape, which can be really valuable. And so there is a role that government can play as well in helping companies to figure out how to be as resilient as they need to be.
Well, I think you're exactly right. Things like parallel processing, mirror image systems, those things can really help. Thank you all for being here today, and see my time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Rose, and thank you for that line of questioning. I know we have several other members who still want to ask questions and are on the way from the vote, so I'm just going to ask a second round while we're waiting for those senators to show up, and then hopefully you guys can go on your way. I know it's been a long morning already, and I know it is a little chilly in here. I wanted to go back to Senator Cruz's question. You know, he was asking about other federal agencies and our own data security issues. And I know now a couple of members have had discussions with you around NIST. So one, why isn't the FTC just good guidance for the rest of the federal government as it relates to data security? I mean, I look at NIST as a standard setting, but they're certainly not the policeman on the beat. And we're not asking the FTC to be the policeman on the beat for all of the federal government. But I guarantee you, you're definitely not going to get that out of NIST. So here we have this burgeoning issue of cybersecurity for us as a nation, and we need to build our own capacity. We need to build the own capacity of a very technical, skilled team. And if you ask me, I have found that there are people in the bowels of organizations who are very, very technical. And then I know people at the very high ends of operations in various aspects of the federal government who are also very knowledgeable and very technical. But I see a gulf of people in between who aren't. And that's the most frustrating thing. So could the FTC, I mean, what do you see this role? Are you back to this notion of we're just going to have to find somebody else to be the government enforcer here to make sure that agencies are doing the oversight?
I think what I meant wasn't that the FTC can't provide guidance. In fact, the FTC has been brought in by OPM and OMB to help when there have been breaches to deal with the aftermath because of their expertise. So I think the FTC could work with NIST to provide guidance for the federal government, and there may be others, the cybersecurity folks that would participate in that too. What the FTC can't do is make the other agencies follow it. because it's just a lateral agency. And I was in the trenches long enough with squabbles between the agencies and Ed to know that that's just not workable. But the FTC could certainly help provide leadership and guidance that OMB could then push down to the agencies.
Okay. Anything else, Dr. Felton, on that? So another point that was brought up, so Ms. Rich, on when consumers have been harmed, do you believe in their common law rights to sue and to have damages and, correct?
I generally do believe that, absolutely.
Okay.
But I'm speaking, practically about, because it's been such an intractable issue, that if you have a really strong law, sufficient resources to enforce it, 50 state AGs on the beat too, that would be a very good outcome, much better than we have now, and could mean we don't need to have a private right of action, especially since private rights of action can complicate an already complicated issue.
Well, I would beg to differ on that from a global perspective. I think yesterday was a perfect example of how you can, if you don't have real damages that someone is going to feel in these situations, you're going to have a lot of behavior that just continues. And just like on the data security side here, again, Mr. Lee's been very crisp and clear about the amount of damage that's being done to consumers. But when you think about these organizations across the board, they're not paying the price. I guarantee you that Equifax had nowhere near the damage done to it as the individuals did if you were looking at it in a comparison. I mean, when people have lost their homes, lost their jobs, lost their health care, lost these things, it's been pretty significant. So I would just hope that we'll certainly get to you with some questions about what you meant on those middle ground issues, but I'm going to turn to my colleague, Senator Peters.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for this hearing and a very important discussion. I want to thank each of our witnesses for being here. First off, I just want to echo my colleagues' calls that we've heard here in committee for increased reporting on data breaches and how important that is. Actually, just moments ago, where I just came from, the Homeland Security Committee where I chair, we just marked up a bipartisan bill that I sponsored that would require certain entities to report substantial cyber incidents to CISA, and included in that, of course, are major data breaches. I certainly think this bill will address some of the challenges that have been mentioned today, although we know there are many more. I've also introduced legislation in this committee, the Data Broker List Act, which would require data brokers to have in place comprehensive information security systems to prevent those data breaches from happening in the first place. We want to be on the front end, certainly. My first question is for Lee. When we think about ransom attacks, we know that they've become increasingly common, and data security legislation has to certainly limit these illicit acts. As an example, in 2020, Ukrainian hackers targeted a healthcare company with locations throughout Monroe County in Michigan, and in order to unlock stolen patient financial data, they had to pay over $30,000 ransom. So my question for you, Mr. Lee, is can you give me examples of data security standards that would have the most impact in trying to prevent ransomware attacks from occurring in the first place? What would you suggest that we really focus on?
It really all begins with let's prevent the data breach, because ransomware attacks are fueled by data that has already been stolen. So if we can prevent that from ever happening, for the most part, then you're going to have a tremendous impact downstream. You won't have as many ransomware attacks. You'll still have them because there's multiple ways of doing it, but you won't have what you have today, where largely ransomware attacks are committed because someone has a login and a password and can infiltrate a system. Or the SolarWinds attack, which was because of a administrator's password that had been acquired, and then it was a weak password to begin with, so that didn't help. So if we can prevent those breaches from ever occurring because of stronger cybersecurity standards that are enforceable, we'll get to ransomware.
Well, that's good to hear. Well, my bill, the Data Broker List Act, would require data brokers to have in place a comprehensive information security system to mitigate that risk that you mentioned, Mr. Lee. And because of the role that data brokers play in today's data marketplace, it seems to me it's critical that regulations address their storage, their use, and certainly, as you mentioned, the security of their data. Ms. Rich, how do you believe data brokers should be addressed if we're looking at comprehensive data security legislation? Could you be specific about data brokers?
The opposite. In the same way that Dr. Felton talked about social networks, it being a matter of degree because they have so much data, the same can be said about data brokers, and their whole business is data. So they've got a lot of it, and they have to, in terms of scalability, they would be at the top of the scale of protecting information because they also have a lot of sensitive data. Of course, for data brokers, privacy is a critical issue too. I mean, just as critical. You know, when can they, what kind of vetting do they need to do? Who can they sell the data to? Are they sure when they got the data that it wasn't subject to, controls, et cetera? So privacy is a huge piece of the data broker story as well.
And a follow-up to that, what are there tools that we could provide to the FTC to actually enforce standards that are in place for data brokers?
If there were standards in place for data brokers, then all the tools that Chair Cantwell is trying to provide to the FTC, more resources for technologists, for attorneys, for this new privacy bureau would be extremely valuable, essential. But there need to be standards in place because there aren't any really now.
You have to start with standards, but you also have to make sure those standards are followed and enforcement. It's a two-step process that is both critical, as you well know. Well, the Michigan patients that had their financial data stolen, as I mentioned earlier in my comments, were given free credit monitoring service after that, but their data obviously was already compromised, already a big issue. So, Mr. Lee, I know you noted in your testimony a study by the University of Michigan that showed that we're not equipping victims with the information needed to protect themselves. What are some of the most effective ways, in your mind, to support victims of these identity crimes? Is there something we're not doing now that we should be thinking about?
Well, first of all, we should be more transparent in what we tell people. The Michigan study, along with the Carnegie Mellon study, make it very clear that literally the language we use in the notices is so dense, people don't read it.
Right.
They don't even realize that they have been breached not once, not twice, 3 and 4 times, and they don't know it. And so they don't do anything. There are very basic steps that people can take that we should tell them about, but we don't. And we're not, because of the patchwork of state laws, each one being a little bit different, each one has a different form and both substance. So something as simple as, well, credit monitoring is great, a credit freeze is better, because a credit freeze means no one can open an account with your information. They cannot incur debt on your behalf. A credit monitoring, while it's helpful, it tells you what has happened. The horse is out of the barn. We don't need just that. We need a lot more robust kinds of information and that we give to consumers, we give to victims, and we need to do it ahead of time too. So that's a different conversation, but the whole concept of a victim support structure that is lacking in this area of identity crime, we can prevent a lot of it, and we can equip people to prepare them for it when it does happen.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
So do we have Senator Warnock remotely? No. Okay. And we still may be waiting for one more senator. I wanted to ask you, Ms. Rich, on your testimony, written testimony, I'm not sure if you mentioned it in your oral testimony, you were talking about common carriers being under the FTC instead of the FCC. Would you elaborate on that?
Well, I didn't say instead. I didn't say that.
Okay.
But I do...
On privacy and data.
I do believe that it would be important to create a level playing field, both for consumers and for businesses, if you have a data security law. And so for that reason, covering nonprofits and common carriers and allowing the FTC, with the new resources you're giving it, to bring enforcement would be very important. As to the FCC, I don't think they've been in the data security. if you were going to switch it over, I'd have to look at a provision and see whether it would reduce any protections that exist now. But I don't think this has been an area where the FCC has been active or has particular expertise. I think the FTC could do an amazing job with the resources you're going to give it on data security and the authority you're going to give it on data security.
Dr. Felton?
I agree. The FCC is good at what they do, but I think having that level playing field and allowing the FTC to not face these sort of artificial boundaries in how it does enforcement would be valuable.
Mr. Lee, did you have any comment on this point? I know it might not be your area, but you might have seen cases in here. No, okay.
Nope.
All right.
Thanks for asking, though.
Thank you. Well,
Could you give me 30 seconds to just address the private right of action
Yes,
again? Because
yes.
I think you think I don't care about consumers and their rights. My point was just that if with the proper resources and authority, the FTC and the states could also represent consumers and get money back for them, redress, civil penalties, whatever is appropriate, if the law is strong enough and it gives the remedies. That was my point.
so again, not to put words in your mouth, but you're saying, yes, if consumers are harmed, they should be able to get actual damages. The question is, what process should they be able to get actual damages?
Yes.
And so I think that is going to be a big discussion point among us as well, and so I really appreciate your input on it.
Yeah.
I didn't think that you didn't. I just wanted to make clear that this actually is the issue. And when you look at yesterday, in my opinion, you look at how do you create bright lines within big organizations? How do you have out there in the public and within these companies, because you don't have a CFO or CTO or even the general counsel running around every day saying these are the do's and don'ts. But you do if there is a strong law and you know that the company can be held accountable for it. That's the kind of thing we're looking for. And we have to build in, as my colleague Senator Klobuchar was saying, this is like an entire growth area of our economy. And we want it to succeed. I sit here and listen to it. There are a lot of good algorithms, trust me. There are a lot of algorithms that are helping us even today. So yes, now we have a lot of people who are going to understand what algorithms are all about. But the point is, we have to have some bright lines here. And as much as I want a powerful FTC, I think that Europe still fails to get the job done. We kind of know what that looks like. We can see what the European model is accomplishing, and we can see that it has shortcomings. So we know this, that as Mr. Lee was saying, that if you can have these people be accountable to their the damage, the same kind of damage that's being done to consumers, you're going to get a better response in policing them. And the information age is going to continue to change. So this committee has been very prescriptive, I would say, for the amount of time I've been on this committee, very prescriptive. So that's where it's gotten us. So the information age is growing by leaps and bounds. In each little sector, we've tried to be prescriptive. And I would say, have we accomplished what we've wanted to accomplish? I would say no, given Mr. Lee's data and given what we just had yesterday. I would say we need something stronger. We need a very bright line on accountability. But anyway, we'll get to this discussion with our colleagues, and hopefully, I think the one thing people who've been watching these hearings will see is that we have a very engaged committee, and it doesn't matter how many cameras are outside that door, okay? Because you had a lot of people here and a lot of people last week asking and knowing this subject area. They are drafting or have drafted legislation in this area. Practically every member of the committee has been on one form or another of these legislatures. So I do think the moment is here. And again, just thank you all for your expertise. This is very, very helpful. And I think that hopefully our colleagues will come together at this moment and we'll be able to get some legislation to help bolster and protect consumers. So with that, the hearing record will remain open for 1 week until October 13th, 2021. Any senators who'd like to submit questions for the record should do so by that date. We ask that responses be returned to the committee as quickly as possible, but no later than August 27th, 2021. So with that, the hearing is concluded.